was exalting Christ, and this year it's proclaiming the love of Christ, which is a much more outward-oriented action, while exalting can be much more inward. Of course, you can exalt Christ outwardly, but just inherently exalting Christ is much more of a you to God kind of action. While proclaiming, it's kind of hard to proclaim to yourself. You can, but this is much more an outwardly expressed year that we're going to be focusing around. And so the scripture I wanted to focus around was in 1 Timothy. But before we look into that verse, I want to give some background, some context to 1 Timothy. So let's take a way step back. So 1 Timothy, it's grouped together with two other books. It's grouped together with 2 Timothy, of course, and it's also grouped together with Titus. And these three books are known as the pastoral epistles. And they're called that because they're addressed to individuals with pastoral oversight. So as we know, or if we didn't know, we will know now that Timothy was a mentee. He was being trained by Paul. And Titus was also one of his mentees, and Paul being the mentor to Titus. And so these three books are grouped together as a book, or as a whole, called the pastoral epistles for people in leadership. And so usually leaders would be addressed to these kind of books because these two young men had leadership. But today we'll be looking at Timothy. Timothy, his name actually comes from the Greek name Timotheus, which means honor of God. And as we know, in his ministry, he definitely did fulfill his name's meaning of honor of God. So this book, 1 Timothy, it was written in 62 to around 66 AD. And so we know it was pretty recently after Jesus had died. It was written because the church in Ephesus, where Timothy was placed, it was starting to fall into error. Let's go to 1 Timothy 1, verse 3 to 4. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus. Let's stop there. So we see that Paul and Timothy were traveling. He was his mentor. And so they were traveling and they got to Macedonia. And from what we can take from this is that Paul was there with Timothy in Ephesus, but he left. And he told him to stay there for a reason, to pastor over the church there. So that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. And so in Ephesus at the time, there was this new thing of Gnosticism that was starting to take over the church. And Paul wanted that to stop. He didn't want that to happen because it's not good to start practicing Gnosticism and to have that starting to seep and infect your church. And so he tasked Timothy with staying there to help protect against Gnosticism and to help encourage people to look towards Christ. And so that's why he was writing this really, the book of Timothy really is just a letter. It's just a very long letter to Timothy. And so he's writing this letter to Timothy to encourage him as he kind of left him there. He tasked him. It's kind of like if Burmy left me with a church. If he's like, Anthony, I want you to stay here in LA and I'm going to go to the Philippines and start God's leading me there. And so he's writing me a letter. He's writing Timothy a letter as a form of encouragement, as a form of just I know it's hard, but I'm going to write you some nice things and some guidelines, because it's there's at that time I don't think there were formal, this is exactly what you're supposed to do, this is how you should handle this. It can be kind of vague. And so when you're young, when you're new in the ministry, it can be intimidating. So that is why Paul wrote that, because of the state of the church in Ephesus, and because Timothy was still new in this. He was still young. So when we look at the relationship of Paul and Timothy, let's go back to the very first time they encountered him. So Paul and Barnabas, when he was with them, they visited Lystra, and when they're there, Paul had healed someone who was crippled at birth, and that led to a lot of the people in Lystra to start following Christ. And at that, there's a lot of commentary that talks about how when he did first go there, Paul was stoned and left for dead. And Timothy saw that. And so that was a good example for Timothy to immediately know that, okay, so Christian ministry isn't all nice stuff. You get stoned sometimes, and you get left for dead. You get persecuted. And so despite knowing this, he still pursued this, because after this, as we look into history, we see that Timothy started reading the Word. He started looking into Christ at a younger age. And this was a good setting, a good way to frame Christian ministry. And despite seeing how Paul received, there were people who accepted Christ and started following, but he was also hated at the same time and left for dead. But that did not stop Timothy in his pursuit, because we know that soon after this, Timothy started getting involved in his church. And so the second time, however, when Paul came back to Lystra, he was with Silas this time. And so he came, and by this time, Timothy was a respected member in his church. And so that entire time in that break, he was actively following Christ. And so now, he's in his mid-teens, mid to late teens now. And by this time, he's now ready to start following with Paul and go into his mentorship. And so they were together for 17 years after this second visit. And so they had years with each other. 17 years is a long time. And so they were close. They were very close. As we know, as we look through the Word, we know that Paul isn't known for writing really complimentary things to people. He's not known for being the most he believes in grace, but he might not be the most tactful person in the world. And so he doesn't always say hey, you're doing a good job over there. Hey, this is just something nice I like. He can be very blunt. He can just cast out what's wrong in someone. He's like, I'm going to rebuke you for doing this. He can be a very direct individual. And so he's not known for being kind. He's grace-filled, and he's a complete, devoted disciple, but he's not the kindest person. However, when we look in 1 Timothy, we see something a little different. We see him being more complimentary towards Timothy. We see him being kinder towards Timothy than he is to most people. And so, at the very start of 1 Timothy, you could go there. 1 Timothy 1. I think it's 1. 1 verse 1. If not, it's okay. But it says, Paul calls Timothy his my true son in the faith. Now, he wasn't his biological son, no, but he considered him like a son, his true son in the faith. And so, you don't call someone that if it's just this is just my friend. No, he considered him like a son. And so, they were very, very close. In Acts 16, verse 1 to 3, just to give a little more context to their relationship and what they had, and how Timothy was, how he handled ministry, how he looked at Christian ministry. Acts 16, verse 1 to 3. Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra. A disciple was there, named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. So that automatically made it so he's not a Jew because his father was Greek. He's mixed. Yeah. So he was well spoken of the brethren at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because the Jews that were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And so Timothy, being so committed to the ministry to Christ, he opted to get circumcised. Now, circumcision isn't something that is just nice and feels good. It's very, very painful. And by this time, he was an adult. He was 18 18. And so he knew what he was doing, and he had his mentor do it for him. So that's not something that just happens, between two casual friends. That's something close to be circumcised by your mentor. It's a close, intimate relationship. That's not something I would just trust some guy in the street to do for me. And not only that, the fact that it's like in today's world, it's like, I won't talk about this deeply, but in today's world, it doesn't even matter anymore. It's not a thing in our society. But then it was. He could not preach to Jews if he wasn't circumcised. They just would not look at him as even a person. They're just like, no, we won't listen to anything you're going to say. And so because Timothy is so committed to Christ, to the ministry, that he opted to get this done, go through that pain and healing process for this, as he was following Paul, and he had Paul do it. So they had a very close relationship, and Timothy was very devout. He was very, very, very focused on following Christ. But in addition to this, we also know that Timothy was considered by some, this is open a little bit more to speculation, but he was considered to be a little timid. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 10 to 11, we see, and in some commentaries, people say that this is considered to be showing his timidity. When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord, as am I. So let no one despise him. Speed him on his way in peace, that he may return to me, for I am expecting him with the brethren. And so in the very first line right there, he says, when Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease. That's usually spoken as someone who is kind of timid, someone who's a little afraid. It's like if someone's comfortable in front of a crowd, if someone's very strong personality, a strong extrovert, they don't need to be put at ease. That's their element, to be surrounded by people. And so it's considered by many that Timothy might have been a little bit timid. He might have been a little nervous in front of a crowd or just in a group of people. Definitely as the pastor, you're always around people. And so Timothy might have been just a little nervous. And so when we start to, I haven't even gotten to the main verse yet, but when we get to the verse, we see that First Timothy as a whole, it was sent from Paul as a concerned mentor for his mentee, that he knows by 17 years, he knows Timothy's personality through and through easily, every day, every night, spending with him. He knows what Timothy is like perfectly. And so he knows that Timothy might need some encouragement. He might need some support, because being with your mentor for so long and then just kind of being left to pastor a church can be scary. It can be intimidating. And so Timothy needed some encouragement. And so we get to the main verse that I'm focusing on is 1 Timothy 4, verse 12. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. And so at the very start where it says, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. In Greek, there's the word for young, which is neotes. And it means youthfulness. And men were called neotes until they were around 40 years old. And according to Irenaeus, in my research, he says, quote, 30 is the first stage of a young man's age and extends to 40, as all will admit. And so, in the eyes of his congregation, who he now is kind of just, like I said, as if Burby were to task me with running this church, I would still be considered young. I am young. I'm 24. I'm probably the oldest one here, really, to be honest. Timothy was considered very young in his church, and at that time they were much more rigid in their culture. And so if you weren't of a certain age, they kind of dismiss what you said. And it's still kind of true in this day and age, and it's for good reason. If there's like a 15-year-old teenager, and he's preaching and he's talking about some deep theology, we would all kind of second guess it. You're like, how do you know this? How do you have the patience to study this? Or have the resources to research this? And so you kind of second guess them. And some members in the church, just knowing humans, would probably want to challenge that. I don't think that's far off reading between the lines to assume that there would be members to try to challenge Timothy in his pastoral leadership, especially given that there are probably leaders in that church that have been there longer than Timothy. And so being tasked with that, there are probably people who would challenge him. And so he was the leader of the church in Ephesus by the time this was written. And he was in his late 20s, probably early 30s. And so he still had a few years, a decade maybe, give or take, until he was out of the stage of neotes, where he wasn't considered young. And so people could look down on him. And immediately that's what Paul says here. He says, don't let anyone despise you. Or don't let anyone look down on you. Some translations say despise. Because you are young. And so he's saying, stand up for yourself. He's like, you know you're preaching for not yourself, you're preaching for Christ. He's like, you know what you believe, you know who you're representing, so you have no reason to be ashamed. You have no reason to let them put you down, especially because of the first part of 1 Timothy where he says they've gone astray. They're starting to believe in false doctrines and weird genealogies. They're starting to practice Gnosticism. And so he wants him not to look at his age and be discriminated for. He wants him to stand up and just say, hey, what I'm teaching is right. What I'm doing is correct. Because he's representing Christ, even though he is in that neotes age. But set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. And each one of those are things that people in leadership need to watch out for. Because each one of them can be a pitfall if they mess up in it. Easily, as we've seen in other verses about Jesus, all other Pharisees would try their best to say, Jesus, you said this, and we are going to call you out on it. And for a normal human who's not perfect in mind and emotional state like Jesus, they could make mistakes. They might be like, oh no, I said that, and they might get scared. And so the second their speech is discredited, people stop believing them. And so he wants them to set the example in speech, in life, just how he lives, in love, how he loves people, and his faith for Christ, and purity. And so we see in this that Paul recognizes the main attributes of a leader, of what people will attack him in as being, while being young, because it's there is the aspect of just being neotes, of being inexperienced, of being young, youthful. But then as a leader, there are all these other things there that people can attack. And so he wants them to set the example, not just kind of follow the example of someone else. He wants Timothy to be the bar for what people look up to in his church as the spiritual, as the pastor, as the leader of his church. And so when we look at this, we see that Timothy had a desire to teach. He had a desire to be respected and to have influence over his congregation. Because if there's a pastor up here and he's preaching, no one's paying attention to him, no one's listening to him, there is no influence. You could be more influenced by someone in the back who has been in the church for 40 years, minus a new pastor that's been there for 2 years. They might have more influence. And so he wanted to have influence. And so when Paul said this, it was a strong encouragement for his conduct in all aspects of his pastoral leadership. And so when we, as Christians today, look at this verse, we can take the phrase young, and in some places literally take it like I can take it literally, and everyone else here can take it literally, since, come on, we're all young. And and when we see the word, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, we can also think of it because what comes with youth? Inexperience comes with youth. You just have not experienced things because you just don't have the life length to experience everything. And so when we look at it as if Paul is writing this to us, we can see that he's saying, don't let anyone look down on you because of your inexperience in something, in your youth, in a field, whether it be in your work, whether it be in friendships, whether it be in things in ministry. Don't let people look down on you because of your youth. And that's one of the first things we do as humans is our pride kind of goes up when we see someone coming in trying to step up in our turf, and they think they might know more than us, and they might know more than us, but we just want to challenge them. And I'm sure everyone here, you don't have to raise your hand, has encountered someone who has challenged them in whatever field or whatever realm it's been, and you've been challenged by someone who's just like, hey, what are you doing here? I don't like the way you're acting right now. And they challenge you because you're quote unquote young, because you might not have the most experience. You might not be old. When everyone was a little younger, like 2 years when you're 26 years old, people might have been challenging you. And so despite being challenged, despite people looking down on you, you see Paul telling us, just don't let them look down on you because you're young, because you might be inexperienced in anything you go, because we still experience new things to this day. And so don't let anyone look down on you because you are inexperienced, because you might not know everything there is to know. But set that example in your conduct as a believer, in your speech, in your life, in your love and faith, and in purity. And so he rounds it out as to what it looks like to set an example for someone. I think that covers just everything, what it looks like when you look up to a leader. You look up to them in their speech, how they talk to people, in their life, their daily life, how they treat their spouse, how they treat their kids, how they treat their friends, how they treat people at a diner, how they treat anyone, servants, how they treat people, anyone, how they treat them. How do they love people? Are they stingy with love? Do they not have grace for people? How do they love people? And their faith, are they actually true to God, or are they just doing it for the face value of it? And in purity, depending on your stage in life, well, actually in all stages of life, purity is important. Purity in marriage, maintaining that just one-on-one is just you and your spouse. Or if you're single, are you sleeping around or are you not? It's usually pretty obvious whether you are or whether you're not. And so just doing all of this rounds you out as a good leader. So when we see this, we know when we're proclaiming the love of Christ, people might challenge us. People, especially here in America, it's kind of annoying. Not kind of, it is annoying, especially in colleges where I go to. It's annoying how challenging every college student is, because they're like, oh, I'm a philosophy major. I know what's in the world. And it gets annoying, but we can set the tone. We don't have to actively disagree with them.
Right.
But we can show them that we're not going to back down in our lifestyle.
That's right.
In everything we're doing. That's how we can proclaim the love of Christ, as we were saying earlier, which applies perfectly to this. How will they know we are Christians? By our love. Amen?